In a desperate attempt to pay off her father's debts, Elizabeth made the difficult decision to sell herself to a wealthy man named Charles for 3 nights. The arrangement was clear. She would spend 3 nights with him, and in return, she would receive enough money to settle her father's debts once their child was born. Their first meeting took place in a dimly lit room, where Charles, hiding behind a screen, began asking Elizabeth a series of probing questions. He wanted to know why she, seemingly healthy, had not married, and why she was willing to do something so extreme. Elizabeth explained that she would do whatever it took to make a living, although she knew Charles only needed her temporarily. His questions made her uncomfortable, but financial pressure forced her to accept the arrangement. For the next 3 days, Elizabeth stayed in an isolated hotel. When she entered the room, she found a well-dressed man who appeared nervous and drank frequently during their conversation. Charles told her they had only 3 days together, and in 10 months, after the baby was born, she would receive a substantial amount of money. However, this payment came with the condition that she would keep the arrangement secret and have no further contact with the child. Elizabeth agreed, understanding that a deal was a deal. On the first night, Elizabeth undressed and lay on her side in bed, allowing Charles to awkwardly perform the ritual. Despite the lack of communication, Elizabeth sensed that Charles was a true gentleman who treated her with utmost respect. The second night saw her feeling more relaxed, beginning to appreciate the intimacy, despite shedding tears afterward, overwhelmed by the shame of sleeping with a stranger. Charles noticed her emotional shift and encouraged her to express her frustrations, subtly changing the dynamics of their relationship. By the third night, Elizabeth had mustered the courage to fully embrace her desires, experiencing a passionate connection that marked a formal farewell to their brief journey together. 10 months later, Elizabeth gave birth to a baby girl, who was taken away immediately before she had a chance to see her. The labor had been long and arduous, and the separation from her child weighed heavily on her. Over the years, Elizabeth's longing for her daughter grew stronger. Each year on her daughter's birthday, she would write down her wishes in her sketchbook, silently wishing her a happy birthday from afar. For 7 years, Elizabeth longed for her daughter, sending silent birthday wishes from afar. Finally, she discovered where her daughter was, and decided to become her governess to meet her. Upon arriving, Elizabeth learned from the servants that her daughter's name was Louisa, a lonely and stubborn child who had already expelled 3 governesses because she refused to be disciplined. Louisa often locked herself in the lake pavilion during her free time, avoiding social interactions. When Elizabeth first met Louisa, the girl greeted her with an unfriendly attitude, immediately telling her to go away. However, Elizabeth was not deterred by Louisa's arrogance. Instead, it only strengthened her resolve to stay and care for her daughter. The next day, when Duke Charles returned and saw Elizabeth, his face was filled with shock. He demanded that she leave immediately, struggling to contain his surprise. Elizabeth often found herself by the memory of her daughter's laughter and everything that transpired when she was born. Charles was furious with Elizabeth for breaking their contract. However, due to the terms of the governess's contract, he was obliged to keep Elizabeth there for a month. To make his point, he shared with Elizabeth what had happened 10 years ago. His wife had suffered an accident that left her in a vegetative state. Charles had sought out Elizabeth to maintain the marriage and continue the family line, never expecting fate to reunite them again. Elizabeth's new role as Louisa's governess proved challenging. Louisa, a rebellious and difficult child, would throw tantrums, even going as far as to pour paint on herself and Elizabeth when she disobeyed. Despite the harsh methods, Elizabeth adhered to Charles's request to discipline Louisa, treating herself the same way she punished the girl. Her goal was not just to teach Louisa academic lessons, but to offer her the motherly love she had been deprived of for so long. Louisa's lack of maternal affection and her father's spoiling had fostered a fearless and stubborn personality in her. On the first day of class, Louisa resisted learning and mocked Elizabeth for being poor and uneducated. Elizabeth responded by locking Louisa in the classroom, refusing to comfort her no matter how much she cried. Charles, unable to bear his daughter's suffering, wanted to stop the lessons immediately. Yet, Elizabeth remained resolute, recognizing that Louisa's long-neglected emotional needs required a firm hand. Elizabeth assured Charles that she would share in any punishment Louisa received, which eventually made Charles relent. True to her word, Elizabeth matched Louisa's rebelliousness with patience and empathy. When Louisa refused to eat dinner and cursed her, Elizabeth did not waver, even humorously engaging with Louisa's outbursts. Over time, Louisa's resistance began to wane, and she became interested in the cards on the table. Seizing the moment, Elizabeth started teaching her basic words and grammar, weaving in stories about light and fire to capture her imagination. She described fire as magical, a force that could stop time and free people from rules when it was extinguished. Louisa listened intently, but her behavior soon grew more challenging. In a moment of frustration, Elizabeth revealed a harsh truth to Louisa. As a woman, she would eventually lose everything to her husband upon marriage, except for her mind, which no one could take from her. This revelation, delivered with love and tolerance, ultimately won Louisa over. She stopped resisting lessons and began to study earnestly. Witnessing his daughter's transformation, Charles was deeply grateful and gradually developed a different kind of affection for Elizabeth. Charles continued his nightly visits to his wife's bedside, sharing his thoughts and feelings with her unconscious form. However, he found his mind increasingly occupied by thoughts of Elizabeth. Meanwhile, Elizabeth harbored her own feelings for Charles, the man who had once bought her virginity with money. She would watch him swim at the lake, admiring his body through the blurred glass, and feeling a burning love growing inside her. One night, their mutual feelings came to a head when they met in the study. Charles took the initiative to share with Elizabeth the events of 7 years ago, reflecting on how their lives had intertwined and how fate had brought them back together in such an unexpected way. As they talked, the bond between them deepened. When their eyes met again, all the feelings they had suppressed came rushing to the surface. That night, they let go of all moral restraints and finally expressed the long-suppressed fire in their hearts. Sensitive Louisa, who was spying on her father's relationship with Elizabeth, wandered onto the frozen lake. The ice suddenly broke, and she fell into the water. Elizabeth saw this and immediately jumped into the biting cold water, breaking through the ice to rescue Louisa. Although Elizabeth had always been by Louisa's side as a teacher, her actions revealed her true identity as Louisa's real mother. She promised the sleeping Louisa that she would never leave her. As time passed, Louisa slowly began to open her heart to Elizabeth. She knew that the sick lady she visited daily was not her real mother, but she continued to see her. Louisa loved the lake pavilion, seeing it as her own space with her mother. In winter, as it snowed heavily, Charles's father, Lord Clare, returned. A hedonist, Lord Clare enjoyed extravagant activities and held a Christmas ball soon after his arrival. Although Charles disliked dancing, when he was alone with Elizabeth, he couldn't resist putting his arm around her waist and spinning her around the room. Their relationship grew rapidly after that. Charles sometimes even entertained the thought of taking Elizabeth and Louisa away with him. But as a married man and the heir to his family, he had great responsibilities. He couldn't allow himself to have such unrealistic dreams. Soon after, a group of uninvited guests arrived at the estate, bringing trouble to Charles's business. He had to sell everything to pay off his loans. The cold wind of the night took his wife's life swiftly. Although Elizabeth had no part in the affair, she knew Charles had some connection to it. Just then, Louisa entered Elizabeth's room and accidentally saw her picture book, finally realizing that Elizabeth was her mother. Confused and hurt, Louisa asked why Elizabeth had given her away. Elizabeth explained that she sold Louisa for £500, trying to make light of it. Louisa, in her innocence, was happy that Elizabeth had made a lot of money. In the end, they forgave each other for their sins and left the manor in a carriage, setting out to find a new life. This marked the conclusion of the movie Firelight. Life is inevitably filled with unexpected events, and when people encounter the unexpected, it takes time to adapt, change, and sort out their emotions and desires.